Last year, my school organized a trip to an old forest resort. Everyone was excited, including me. The resort was deep in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and a strange silence. It sounded adventurous. We packed our bags, loaded onto the school bus, and began the journey early in the morning. The first half of the trip was fun. We played games on the bus, sang songs, and even teased each other about ghosts in the woods. "Imagine if the trees start moving at night," one of my friends joked. We laughed, but deep down the thought gave me chills. After a long drive, we arrived at the resort. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd see in a scary movie. The wooden cabins were old, and the paint was peeling. The air was cold even though it was summer. Something about the place felt off. Our teacher, Mrs. Patel, told us to stick together. She reminded us about the rules. No wandering off alone, especially at night. We nodded, but I could tell some of my classmates weren't paying attention. We were split into groups of 4 for the cabins. My group included my best friend Arav, a quiet girl named Mira, and Raj, the class clown. Our cabin was the furthest from the main lodge, near the edge of the forest. Arav joked, "Great, if something scary happens, we'll be there." That evening, we had dinner around a big campfire. The teachers told us stories, but one of the older kids, Karan, started sharing a local legend. "People say this forest is haunted by a woman," Karan began, his voice low and dramatic. "She was searching for her lost child and never found him. Now, she roams the forest, crying at night. If you hear her, don't follow the sound, or she'll take you instead." The teachers told him to stop, but the story had already gotten to us. That night, as we got ready for bed, the wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked. "Do you think it's true?" Mira whispered as we turned off the lights. "Of course not," Raj said, but even he sounded unsure. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing. The next day, we went hiking. The forest was beautiful but eerie. The trees were so tall they blocked most of the sun. As we walked, I noticed carvings on some of the tree trunks, symbols I didn't understand. They looked old, almost ancient. "What do you think these mean?" I asked Arav. He shrugged. "Probably just some kids messing around." But Mira looked worried. "They don't look like something kids would make," she said softly. The teachers called us back before we could explore further. I couldn't stop thinking about those carvings. That night, something woke me up. It was faint at first, like a soft whimpering. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound grew louder. It was a woman crying. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Arav, who was sleeping on the bunk below me. He sat up, eyes wide. "Yeah, I hear it." Raj and Mira woke up too. We all listened frozen. The sound was coming from the forest. "It's probably just an animal," Raj said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's check it out," Arav suggested. "Are you crazy?" I hissed. Mrs. Patel said not to go into the forest at night, but Arav was already putting on his shoes. "If it's nothing, we'll be back in 5 minutes." Reluctantly, we followed him. The forest was pitch dark, and our flashlights barely helped. The crying grew louder as we moved deeper into the woods. My heart was pounding, and I could tell the others were scared too. Suddenly, the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. We stood there, not knowing what to do. Just as we decided to head back, Mira screamed, "There's someone there!" We turned our flashlights in the direction she was pointing. For a second I saw it, a shadowy figure standing between the trees. It was too tall and thin to be a person. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its arms hung in a way that didn't seem right. "Run!" Arav yelled. We bolted back to the cabin, tripping over roots and branches. When we finally got inside, we locked the door and pushed a chair against it. "What was that?" Raj gasped, struggling to catch his breath. No one had an answer. We stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, Karan and his group didn't show up for breakfast. The teachers thought they were just sleeping in, but when they went to check, their cabin was empty. Their bags were still there, but the boys were gone. Panic spread among us. The teachers called the local authorities, who searched the forest. They found no trace of Karan or his friends. That evening, we were all called to the main lodge. Mrs. Patel told us we'd be leaving the next morning. Until then, stay in your cabins, she warned. Do not open the door for anyone. That night was the worst. The crying started again, louder this time, as if it were right outside our cabin. We huddled together, too scared to move. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. "Who is it?" Arav asked, his voice shaking. No answer, just more knocking. "Don't open it," Mira begged. But Arav slowly moved toward the door. Before he could touch it, the knocking stopped. The silence was unbearable. We stayed awake until morning. When the sun finally rose, we packed our bags and left as quickly as we could. The missing boys were never found, and no one could explain what had happened. Even now, I can't forget that trip. Sometimes, I dream about the forest and wake up to the sound of crying. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know one thing: I'm never going back. When we returned to school, the trip became a topic no one wanted to talk about. The teachers avoided discussing it, and the students whispered about Karan and the others when the teachers weren't around. Some students had wild theories about what happened. Maybe they got lost and are still out there, one boy said. Or maybe it was a bear, another girl suggested. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. What we saw in the forest that night wasn't something normal. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure standing between the trees. For weeks after the trip, I started having nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the forest, alone. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching out like hands. I could hear the crying again, but this time it was closer. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The crying would turn into a scream, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat. I wasn't the only one. Arav told me he was having the same dreams. "It's like the forest won't leave us alone," he said one day after school. His face looked pale, and he seemed different, quieter, more distant. Even Raj, who always joked about everything, stopped smiling. He avoided talking about the trip and rarely hung out with us anymore. Mira, who was already quiet, became even more withdrawn. She started skipping school, and when I tried to call her, she didn't answer. One day, Mira didn't come to school at all. Our teacher told us her parents had reported her missing. The news hit me like a punch to the stomach. Mira was gone, just like Karan and his friends. Arav and I decided to visit her house after school. Her mother looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She was acting strange after the trip, she told us. She kept saying she could hear someone calling her name at night, and then she just vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think she went back to the forest?" I asked Arav after we left her house. He shook his head but didn't say anything. I could tell he was thinking the same thing. A few days later, Arav came to me with a wild idea. "We have to go back to the forest," he said. I stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Are you crazy? After everything that happened? No way." But Arav was determined. "Think about it. Mira's missing and we still don't know what happened to Karan. What if they're still out there? We can't just do nothing." I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew he was right. The nightmares weren't stopping, and I felt like the forest was calling me back. Reluctantly, I agreed. Arav and I made a plan. We told our parents we were staying over at each other's houses and packed flashlights, snacks, and our phones. It felt wrong sneaking out, but something was pulling us back to that forest. We took a bus to the edge of the woods and walked the rest of the way to the resort. It was abandoned now, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. The place looked even scarier than before. "We should stick to the trail," I suggested. But Arav shook his head. The crying didn't come from the trail. It came from deeper inside. I didn't argue. We followed the direction of the sound from that night, using our flashlights to light the way. The forest felt different this time, darker, heavier, like it was alive. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. In the center was something I hadn't seen before, a circle of stones with the same carvings I'd noticed on the trees during the hike. Inside the circle was an old rusted lantern, still glowing faintly. What is this?" I whispered. "I don't know," Arav replied. He stepped closer, but before he could touch anything, we heard it again, the crying. It was louder this time, and it was coming from all around us. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I saw them. Shadows moving between the trees. They were tall and thin, like the figure we'd seen that night. They weren't walking, they were gliding toward us. "Run!" Arav shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran as fast as we could, but no matter how far we went, the crying followed us. It was inside my head now, echoing like a scream. I tripped and fell, and when I looked up, one of the shadows was standing over me. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was hollow, like a black void. It reached out, and I felt an icy grip on my arm. Arav pulled me to my feet, and we kept running. Finally, we burst out of the forest and onto the road. The crying stopped, and the silence was almost worse. We never spoke about what happened that night. Arav and I swore we'd never go back, no matter what. But the nightmares didn't stop. Sometimes, I wake up with scratches on my arms, like something is trying to pull me back into the forest. Mira was never found, and neither were Karen or his friends. The resort was shut down, and no one goes near that forest anymore. But I know it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes I hear faint crying when I'm alone, and I wonder if it's calling me back. I'll never forget that school trip. It started as an adventure, but it became a nightmare I can't escape. A few weeks after our return to the forest, something even stranger began to happen. One morning, I woke up and noticed a strange symbol etched into my wrist. It wasn't drawn or scratched. It looked like a burn, but there was no pain. The mark was small and circular, resembling the carvings we saw on the trees and stones in the clearing. I showed it to Arav, and his face turned pale. "I have the same thing," he whispered, rolling up his sleeve. There it was, the same mark, in the exact same spot on his wrist. "Do you think this is from them?" I asked. He nodded, his voice shaking. "It has to be. I've been feeling strange since that night, like I'm being watched." I didn't want to admit it, but I felt the same way. Everywhere I went, I felt like invisible eyes were following me. The shadows in my room seemed darker, longer, and the crying, it was getting louder, even when I was wide awake. Desperate for answers, Arav and I decided to find out more about the forest. We went to the library and started searching for anything related to the area's history. That's when we came across an old article about a woman named Malini. According to the article, Malini was a healer who lived near the forest over a century ago. Villagers believed she could cure illnesses with her knowledge of herbs and rituals. But when a deadly plague swept through the village, people blamed her, accusing her of witchcraft. They claimed she had summoned the plague as revenge for being treated as an outcast. The villagers dragged Malini into the forest and burned her alive. Before she died, she cursed the forest and all who entered it. She swore that anyone who disrespected the land would hear her cries and never leave the forest alive. "What if the curse is real?" I asked Arav, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. We decided to visit an elderly man named Ramesh, a local historian who was mentioned in the article. When we knocked on his door, he was hesitant to speak at first, but when we showed him the marks on our wrists, his expression changed. "You shouldn't have gone into that forest," he said gravely. "The mark is a warning. It means she's claimed you." "What does that mean?" Arav asked, his voice rising in panic. Ramesh sighed. "It means she won't stop until you join her in the forest." After that meeting, things got worse. The crying was no longer limited to nighttime. It followed us everywhere. I heard it in the middle of class, in crowded streets, even during family dinners. No one else seemed to notice, but Arav and I couldn't escape it. One night, I woke up to find my room freezing cold, even though it was summer. The window was closed, but the curtains were moving as if a strong wind was blowing. Then I saw it, the same shadowy figure from the forest, standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, but I could feel its hollow eyes staring at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen. The figure slowly raised its arm, pointing toward the window. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The next morning, I called Arav. He sounded terrified. "It was in my room last night," he said. I think it wants us to come back." We knew we couldn't ignore it any longer. The forest wasn't going to let us go. Arav and I decided to return one last time to end it, whatever it was. We prepared ourselves as best we could, bringing salt, iron rods, and anything else we'd read might protect us from spirits. This time, the forest felt even darker, as if it knew we were coming. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes. The crying was constant now, louder with every step. When we reached the clearing, the lantern was still there, glowing faintly. But this time, we weren't alone. Figures began emerging from the shadows, their forms flickering like dying flames. I recognized some of them, Karan, Mira, and the others who had disappeared. Their eyes were blank, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and pain. "They're trapped," Arav whispered. "We have to free them." "How?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He pointed to the lantern. "It's the source. We have to destroy it." As we approached the lantern, the figures became more aggressive. They lunged at us, their icy hands clawing at our skin. I swung the iron rod, and to my surprise, it passed through them, causing them to dissolve into mist. Arav reached the lantern first. He hesitated for a moment, then smashed it with a rock. The glass shattered, and the glow disappeared. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the ground beneath us began to shake. A deafening scream filled the air, a scream so loud it felt like my head would explode. The shadowy figure from before appeared, towering over us. It let out a final, bone-chilling cry before dissolving into the air. When we woke up, we were lying on the edge of the forest. The marks on our wrists were gone, and the crying had stopped. The forest looked normal, like any other patch of trees. We never spoke about what happened that night. The nightmares stopped, and life slowly returned to normal. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel a chill in the air and wonder if the forest is truly at peace, or if it's still waiting for its next visitors. After that night, Arav and I made an unspoken promise. We would never step foot near that forest again. The nightmares stopped, the strange marks on our wrists were gone, and the crying faded into memory. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The authorities eventually ruled Karan, Mira, and the others as missing, their cases unsolved. The forest was officially declared off limits, and rumors of its haunted nature spread like wildfire. No one dared to go near it anymore. The resort was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by nature. Arav and I stayed close, but something about us had changed. We both carried the weight of what we'd seen, the memories of that horrifying trip. We tried to move on, but the events of those nights left scars, ones that couldn't be seen but were deeply felt. A few years later, I moved to another city for college. Life became busy, filled with new friends, classes, and distractions. I stopped thinking about the forest as much, though it occasionally crept back into my thoughts late at night. Arav and I drifted apart, not intentionally, but time and distance have a way of doing that. One day, I got a letter from Arav. It was unexpected, handwritten in shaky, uneven script. "Something's wrong," the letter began. "The nightmares are back. I can hear the crying again." My hands trembled as I read it. Arav begged me to call him to talk, but I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe it was all over. I wanted to believe we were free. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. Days turned into weeks and I heard nothing. Eventually, I found out from mutual friends that Arav had disappeared. His parents said he left his room one night and never came back. Just like Mira. Just like Karan. Even now, I can't escape the memories of that school trip. I've tried to tell myself it's over, that whatever haunted the forest is gone. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, that faint, distant sound of crying. It's always just at the edge of my hearing, like a whisper in the wind. I've learned to live with it, but I know deep down that it will never truly leave me. The forest took something from me that I can never get back, and sometimes I wonder if one day it will come to take me too. Last year, my school planned a trip to an old castle on the outskirts of our town. Everyone in my class was excited. The castle was famous for its historical value and beautiful architecture. However, some locals whispered strange stories about it, claiming it was haunted. Of course, we laughed at those rumors, thinking they were just tales to scare tourists. When the day of the trip arrived, the weather was gloomy. Thick, gray clouds hovered in the sky, and a cold breeze made me shiver. Despite the creepy atmosphere, my friends and I were in high spirits. We boarded the school bus, chattering loudly and eating snacks. I was sitting with my best friend Mia, and we spent the ride taking selfies and singing along to songs. The castle stood on top of a hill surrounded by dense woods. As we approached, I noticed how old and eerie it looked. The walls were covered with dark green moss, and some windows were shattered. A tall iron gate, rusty and creaky, guarded the entrance. Even though I didn't believe in ghosts, I felt a chill run down my spine. The tour guide, a man with a gruff voice and a tired expression, welcomed us. He warned us not to wander off, as the castle was large and easy to get lost in. That was the first red flag. Mia nudged me and whispered, "This place is so creepy. Imagine if we got stuck here." I laughed nervously, but deep down I felt uneasy. The tour started in the main hall, which was grand but dusty. Cobwebs hung from the chandelier, and the air smelled damp and stale. The guide told us stories about the castle's history. It belonged to a rich family centuries ago, but they mysteriously disappeared one night. Some say their spirits still roam the halls, searching for visitors to join them. At this point, the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. My other friend, Jake, was cracking jokes to lighten the mood, but his voice sounded forced. It was clear I wasn't the only one feeling weird. As we moved to the dining hall, a loud crash startled us. Everyone froze, looking around. The guide assured us it was probably just the wind knocking something over, but it didn't feel right. Later, we reached a long hallway filled with portraits. The paintings were old and faded, showing serious-looking men and women dressed in fancy clothes. Their eyes seemed to follow us as we walked by. "This is straight out of a horror movie," Mia whispered. I nodded, clutching her arm. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The guide frowned and said, "The electricity here is unreliable, don't worry." But it was hard not to. The flickering continued for a few seconds before the lights went out completely. Panic spread through the group as we stood in total darkness. Some students screamed, and I could hear the teachers trying to calm everyone down. I held Mia's hand tightly, my heart pounding. After what felt like forever, the lights came back on. That's when we noticed someone was missing. "Where's Jake?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. We looked around, but Jake was nowhere to be found. The teachers called out his name, but there was no response. The guide suggested he might have wandered off and got lost. He offered to search for him while we continued the tour, but I wasn't convinced. Jake wouldn't just wander off like that. He was too scared to go anywhere alone in this creepy place. The group moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. Mia and I decided to look for him ourselves. We slipped away from the group when no one was watching. The castle felt even more terrifying without the others. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made us jump. The echo of our voices only made the place seem emptier. Then we heard footsteps. "Mia, did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale. The footsteps grew louder, coming from behind us. We turned around, but no one was there. "Let's get out of here," Mia said, pulling my arm. But as we turned to leave, the footsteps started again, this time faster. It felt like someone, or something, was chasing us. We ran as fast as we could, turning corners and dodging furniture, until we stumbled into a small room. The door slammed shut behind us. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The room was cold and dark, with a single window that let in a faint ray of light. In the corner, there was an old rocking chair. Suddenly, the chair began to move. We froze, staring at it in horror. The chair creaked as it rocked back and forth, even though no one was sitting in it. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Then we heard a whisper, "Leave, now." The voice was faint but chilling. Mia grabbed my hand, and we both started banging on the door, desperate to get out. Just when I thought we were trapped forever, the door flew open. Standing there was Jake. "Where were you guys?" "I've been looking for you," he said, looking confused. We stared at him, too shocked to speak. He didn't seem scared or upset, just annoyed that we had disappeared. We quickly left the room and rejoined the group. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. The teacher scolded us for wandering off, and the guide insisted we must have imagined things. To this day, I don't know what we experienced in that castle, but every time I think about it, I get One thing is for sure, I'll never go back there again. After we rejoined the group, the rest of the tour went by uneventfully, but something felt different. The air around us was heavier, and I noticed that even the guide seemed eager to wrap things up. Mia and I didn't speak much after what we'd seen, and Jake acted like nothing had happened. Finally, we left the castle and boarded the bus. The dark clouds had cleared, and the sun was beginning to set. The warmth of the outside world felt like a relief after the cold, eerie atmosphere of the castle. As the bus pulled away, I glanced back one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at one of the broken windows. A figure, tall and shadowy, was watching us. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't say anything to Mia or Jake. I just sat quietly for the rest of the ride home, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. When I got home that evening, I tried to shake off the strange feeling. But that night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint creak of a rocking chair and a whisper in the darkness, "Leave, now." Even now, months later, I still dream about that castle. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hall outside my room, or I wake up feeling like someone is watching me. I haven't told anyone because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. But deep down, I know what I felt was real. And I know I'll never forget it. Last summer, school organized a trip to the mountains. We were all so excited. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, hiking, camping, and sitting around a campfire. I packed my bag with snacks, a flashlight, and extra clothes. We didn't know that this trip would turn into something none of us would ever forget. The first day went perfectly. We reached the campsite by noon, set up our tents, and enjoyed the fresh mountain air. That night, our teacher, Mr. Wilson, lit a campfire and told us scary stories. We laughed and joked about how none of those stories could be real, but deep inside, I had this uneasy feeling. The forest around us was so quiet, almost too quiet. The second day, we went hiking in a part of the forest that wasn't marked on the map. "This will be an adventure," Mr. Wilson said cheerfully. The trail was narrow, and the trees grew so close together that hardly any sunlight got through. After walking for about an hour, we reached a clearing with an old abandoned cabin. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Its wooden walls were broken, and the door hung on one hinge. "Let's check it out," someone said. I didn't want to go inside, but everyone else seemed excited, so I followed. The air was cold and smelled damp. There was broken furniture, cobwebs, and strange symbols carved into the walls. One of my classmates, Sarah, picked up a dusty book from the floor. "Look, it's some kind of diary," she said. She opened it and began reading aloud. The words didn't make sense. They sounded like gibberish. But as she read, the wind outside started to howl. The door slammed shut on its own and the temperature dropped. "Stop reading," I shouted, but Sarah kept going, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the room went dark. My flashlight flickered, and then I saw something in the corner, two glowing eyes staring at us. It wasn't human. It was tall and shadowy, with long, twisted limbs. Everyone screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The shadow moved closer, and we huddled together, crying and shaking. Then Mr. Wilson shouted, "Stay calm! Use your flashlight." I pointed my flashlight at the shadow, and it hissed, shrinking back. We all did the same, and somehow the door creaked open. We ran as fast as we could back to the campsite, leaving the cabin and the shadow behind. Nobody spoke a word until we were safely in our tents. That night, none of us slept. The next morning, we packed up and went back to the bus early. Nobody wanted to stay another day. When we told the school about what happened, they thought we were just making up stories. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Even now, I sometimes wake up at night, thinking I see those glowing eyes in the corner of my room. After the trip, things slowly went back to normal, but the memory of the cabin stayed with us. Sarah, who had read from the strange book, stopped talking about what happened altogether. She even avoided sitting near any of us who had been there that day. A week later, I had a dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. In it, I was back in the cabin, and the shadow was standing over me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. When I woke up, there was a strange mark on my wrist, shaped like one of the symbols from the cabin wall. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but then I saw Sarah at school with the same mark on her wrist. She noticed me staring, pulled her sleeve down quickly, and walked away without a word. From then on, I've tried to forget about the trip. I never go near forests, and I make sure to avoid talking about what happened with anyone who was there. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. And on nights when the wind howls just like it did in the cabin, I swear I hear faint whispers outside my window. Some things are better left unexplored.